All right, Kristen, I am going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jessica. So I am so excited to get to introduce Ryan Honeyman as our keynote today. Ryan is a partner and worker owner at Lyft Economy. He wrote the B Corp handbook nearly a decade ago in 2014, and he co-authored the second edition in 2019 with Dr. Tiffany Jana. Earlier this year, Ryan published his third book. Oops, I have it right there. I should grab it. Oh, sorry. Anyways, his third book, The Next Economy MBA, Redesigning Business for the Benefit of All Life. Ryan has helped over 80 companies like Patagonia, Allbirds, Ben & Jerry's, King Arthur Flour, all become certified B corporations and to recertify and maximize the value of their B Corp certification. Ryan has also helped organizations create a culture of belonging to promote racial justice, love, joy, and compassion in the workplace. Along with his Lyft Economy team, Ryan helped co-found the Force for Good Fund, a $1 million fund that invests in women and people of color owned Best for the World B Corps. And by Best for the World, that means those who score in the top 10% of all B Corps worldwide. He's also co-host of The Next Economy Now, a Lyft podcast, highlighting leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business for good. Ryan has written articles for major publications like the Stanford Social Innovation Review, Fast Company, and Entrepreneur. He's been a featured speaker at SOCAP, the B Corp Champion Retreat, Stanford D School, Wharton, and many others, including our B Academics Global Roundtable today. So thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. We're going to be doing a fireside chat.
Thanks so much for the intro. And wow, 10 years since the first edition. You just I hadn't thought of it that way. So thank you.
Yeah, so much that has changed since then, since that first edition too. I'm actually regretting, like, I have the first edition right there and I have your Next Economy MBA book right there, but I'm not as professional on the bottom half as I am on the top half. So I'll maybe grab those during a break. So Ryan, we would love to hear you share a bit about your story, how you came to do what you do, consulting with B Corps and writing the B Corp handbook, both the first edition and the second edition, and then starting Lyft Economy and then creating the Lyft Economy MBA program and now writing the Next Economy MBA book. We would love for you to share some of your story. And I know that's probably a really long response. So perhaps we can start with this. What was the impetus behind your writing the first edition of the B Corp handbook almost a decade ago?
Thanks so much, Kristen, and thanks everyone for having me. Yeah, I think maybe I'll start a little earlier, just because it sort of helps set the stage for the B Corp. So as many of you in academia and others, you may have got a degree in something you don't actually do now. So I started off in psychology and criminal justice, and my whole thing was trying to reform the criminal justice system and prison reform. And as I got into that work, I realized, it's pretty far, it's pretty like down the sort of river of problems to get to the point of like folks are incarcerated and like, how do we get out? So I was like, how do I, at least in my work, go upstream more to try and figure out what are some of the ways that I can be sort of have a more positive impact sort of up the stream. And so I had this degree in psychology and criminal justice, and I was like reading my brother's books on, for those of you involved in the sustainability space for a while, Cradle to Cradle and Natural Capitalism, some of these like early 2000s books when it was called like Going Green, like we're going green. I feel like folks, we don't really use that terminology anymore, but anyways, I said, okay, so I'm working in systems where I feel like I'm catching folks, the way that I'm interacting with folks feels like too far down the line. So if I go up into the systems, like where is some of the sort of higher impact, high leverage points? And so I basically thought, okay, I'm going to do, sustainability consulting and looking at businesses that want to make a positive impact, because it seemed like so much of the of the carnage in the world comes from like private enterprise, just basically going and doing like whatever they want. And so I found out about the B Corp movement because I was talking to companies about, hey, have you thought about sustainability, et cetera? And this is bringing me to how I got interested in B Corps, because sustainability and going green and a lot of these concepts even still are somewhat hard to define. It's like, what does it mean to be sustainable? Is ExxonMobil sustainable if they have solar panels, or is Patagonia sustainable? Like, what is sustainability? So for me, I was excited about B Corporation, the certified B Corp movement, because it really made things tangible and measurable. And it wasn't just sort of whoever wants to claim they're sustainable wins. It's not like the best marketing budget wins. And so in 2012 or so, I had certified my one-person work from home San Francisco one-bedroom apartment business. And one of the reasons I liked B Corporation is because, a little anecdote, is I tried to become a San Francisco green business. We have a green business program in the Bay Area, and they wouldn't let me because my landlord didn't have a low flow toilet. So I was like, what the heck? I'm a sustainability consultant and I can't become like a SF green business because I don't have this like low flow toilet that my landlord refuses to change. So I was excited about B Corporation because it really looked much more broadly about like what you do and your impact, and allowed you to sort of choose your own path to getting to become a B Corporation. So all that bringing us up to now, Kristen's question around why I wrote the book. So there's the B Corp movement. There's all these terms. There's like the B Corp movement. There's the B economy. There's certified B corporations. There's benefit corporations. And B Lab at the time had a website that had some of this information, but it wasn't sort of laid out in a sort of case-by-case way. Because I was talking to business owners who wanted to know, what is B Corp and why would I want to do it? So the sort of initial impetus behind the book was for me as a consultant to say, here's what B Corps are, why they matter, and how you can do it. And so that was the original idea behind the first edition of the book. And yeah, happy to continue with your questions, Kristen. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. I think I knew part of that, but I didn't realize that not having a low flow toilet was a big part of that piece. So yeah, thanks for sharing. And I think it does, I think we all respect that B Corp certification is so holistic, that it really is looking at every aspect of a venture's operation. So thank you. Would love to hear you then share like what shifts resulted in the second edition. And for those of us who have maybe used both editions in our classes for years, I'm always very careful to tell students, make sure you get the second edition. It's totally different than the first edition. So would love to hear you speak to the vast difference in content between the two editions in just 4 years, because I think it was 2014 and then 2018.
Yeah. Yeah, and so some of that came, so the big difference, there's a few big differences. The biggest one was sort of elevating diversity, equity, inclusion to a central component of the B Corp sort of conversation. Typically in previous conversations, it was around like, hey, you should do like environmental strategy, and you should do, an employee community service program. And oh yeah, you should do like diversity too. But it was sort of like just sort of a part of the different things. And it's a little bit personal why I felt like it was so important to elevate is actually in 2014, my daughter was born. So the first edition of the B Corp handbook came out the same week that my daughter was born. So that was interesting. But as many of you who are parents know, sort of these concepts of, what's happening in the world when you have a kid, it's like, oh, this is going to affect my kid. And so suddenly for me, I had this shift of an intellectual understanding and support of things like women's empowerment and, some of the ideas around like racial justice. But for me, it was like, okay, now I have a child, and all these things that are in the world are suddenly like really not okay. And also the big piece was like, what am I as a white guy? Like, what am I doing? What is my role in creating a world that works for all and create a more just, equitable, and inclusive world? And so part of my journey from understanding my role as a white guy and how I can show up in support of folks of color, but also show up in spaces where folks of color can't show up. And so like speaking to different rooms where I sort of had a positionality and privilege to actually speak about some of these issues. I really felt like in the B Corp community as well, we were starting to have discussions about, what are we doing as a majority white, socially responsible, upper middle class group of folks, like changing the world, and so we started to have conversations in the B Corp community, and I was having those conversations in 2015, 2016, 2017. Black Lives Matter was becoming more and more popular. Donald Trump was elected in our country, hopefully not reelected. I don't want to get too political, but just throwing it out there. And so the second edition was like, okay, we really need to not just have some of these things be like tangential to what we're talking about in the B Corp movement. We actually have to elevate and make them essential. And so I think the big component was having Dr. Tiffany Jana help co-author the book, because as a white guy, I have a ton of blind spots, totally admit that. And so having an expert in diversity, equity, inclusion co-author the book was super helpful. And I think the other big shift was in 2014, I think maybe 60%, 70% of B Corps were in the United States. And, the Bay Area had like 10% of all the B Corps in the world in 2014. And by 2019, it was like, okay, we've got Sistema Bay has been going strong. B Lab Europe has been going strong for a while. The sort of movement builders program in China and Southeast Asia and sort of other countries in Africa. And so it was like, okay, we actually have to write this book in a way that's relevant to a global movement, instead of just like, hey, there's this cool thing that's happening in the US, which was kind of early days B Corp.
Yeah, I'm in hearing your response. I'm just thinking about how much change between 2014 and 2018, because I tend to think of like all the changes since 2020. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. I would love, like, still talking about the second edition. There are a lot of us here today who teach about B corporations and consider this to be like the textbook. It's the book that we assign in all of our classes. So I'd love to ask a two-part question. One is, how did you envision that people would use the book? And then also, how would you like for people, whether we're academics or students or B Corp leaders, to use the book?
Yeah. A funny story is, so in 2014, B Lab bought a ton of copies, and they way overbought the amount of books. And so when I went into their office one time, they had the books as like monitor raisers for different people. So if anyone, if you want, they're really good monitor raisers. If you need to get that ergonomic height for your computer, you can consider it.
Not exactly what you intended.
Yeah. But I do think I was in the small group breakout previous to this. I think academics and you all have one of the most difficult and most important roles in the entire movement, which is, how do we get the data and the sort of longitudinal information to back up what we're talking about in the movement, and how is that actually affecting the marketplace? It's one thing for me to say, hey, you should be a B Corp because it'll increase employee engagement. But if there's no data to show that, companies are like, well, show me, like, where's your information to prove this? Or, so a lot of things are like, if B impact teams are coming together, our students, is this like a one and done thing? Like they had this cool experience, but then they're on with their lives? Or are students sort of staying engaged with like the B Corp movement after they have a B impact team experience? Are companies that are part of the B impact team Are they staying within the community? Are they staying certified? Are they, continuing to engage? So those are pieces that me and others of us in the corporate and the sort of business side, I don't have the skills or experience or expertise to really do that sort of data collection and really look at what's happening and then inform. You can actually have the power to inform what we're doing on the consulting side. So that's one way to really use, I think, the B Corp movement. And I think the book is just, I would just say, use it as a tool and resource. But as many of you know, so much has changed. And this is maybe coming into is that what's going to happen in the next edition of the book, but so much has changed that I would say use it as inspiration and a resource. And then, you all know the best way to engage the stakeholders that you're involved with. So I would just say, use it as inspiration, but don't feel you have to, follow it page by page.
Such a good point about data collection, and also thinking of our colleagues here at B Academics who focus on research, and our research committee, and folks at B Lab Global. And I understand there's now 2 or 3 folks on the B Lab team who have a research focus, and even B Corps like data.world, where they compile a lot of that information. So yeah, I totally hear the importance of that. And a great thought about the way that that information helps to contribute to your handbook. And actually, I hadn't thought to ask this question, but you just sort of mentioned it. So it sounds like maybe there's a 3rd edition planned, and would love to hear your thoughts on that, because so much has changed in the world since the 2nd edition was published, whether it's the impacts of COVID in early 2020, the increasing awareness of issues around systemic racism from the summer of 2020, the quickening of climate change. I just heard this morning on the news that October is documented as the hottest October ever around the world. And then also shifts in B Lab and B Lab's leadership. There's now a B Lab Global. And so, they're now focused around the theory of change. So wondered if that impacts the way you think of the 2nd edition of your handbook and the role it plays, and also if you're planning a 3rd edition and what that might look like.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Honestly, my mind is sort of exploding a little bit trying to think of how do you wrap all of the changes into one book. And so maybe it's, I think it's to be determined what it looks like. But I will say that yes, B Lab used to be what is now B Lab US and Canada. And so that's all changed since 2019. Now there's B Lab Global, and US and Canada is a regional entity, which is how it should be. And, also in the US, where, race is a very big prevalent factor, and sort of an issue of discussion, a hot issue of discussion. And, I've talked to folks in Japan who it's well, for us, it's more about gender and more about women's empowerment. It's not really. And so how do you how do I write a book that's relevant to all these different markets? And so I have not wrapped my head around it. And it probably, the book wouldn't come out till 2025 because of the new standards being released. Even though there's going to be draft standards released, I think in January of 2024, I'm sort of not really trusting that those will actually be the final. And so I don't want to write a book that's then outdated soon after it's published. So basically a long way of saying it would probably, Alexander's laughing a little bit. Maybe it's just a dynamic online book that's constantly updated. No, but yeah, I think 2025 would be the most the earliest that edition would be written, and it will definitely involve a lot of stakeholders and a lot of input and advice, because it's going to be an opportunity and challenge to write a new edition, I think.
We'll be on the lookout for an e-version of the 3rd edition coming sometime in late 2025 or soon thereafter. Thanks, Ryan. So we'd love to hear you share more about how you pivoted from consulting and writing the first edition of the handbook to starting Lift Economy and the Force for Good Fund to creating the Next Economy MBA program and most recently writing your Next Economy MBA text.
Yeah, so I will admit, I've had the last maybe couple years, the B Corp community and B Corp as an idea has been interesting for me. So as some of you may also feel, I've had this question, like, is what we're doing really making a difference? Like, is B Corp, does it matter in the ultimate scheme of things? Or are we just sort of like excited and like kidding ourselves because it's actually not enough? And so I've actually been struggling with that for a while. And I think where I've landed is, I think I can't know if it's enough, but I also can't know if it's not enough. So I was sort of getting myself into a little space of like, there's this great community of 7,000, 8,000 companies, and it feels like we're doing a lot, but there's so many businesses in the world and so many challenges. It felt a little bit hopeless. But I think where I've gotten to is it's hard to know. Like I cannot say that what we're doing is actually not enough. So in a way, I've backed myself out of it to say, even if it's not enough, me making the decision that I should focus on something else or think B Corps are not enough is actually not a great framing, a way to think about it. It's actually limiting. And so I'm going forward. This is sort of like recent in the last 6 months. I've been like, okay, I'm going to go forward full on with B Corp because I don't know what's possible. And so give me a little insight into my own internal struggles with like the whole business and economy system and where B Corp fits in. And
that sounds very much like the founder of Patagonia. Like I've heard him speak multiple times about like, what is sustainability? There's no such thing as like a sustainable clothing company, but we're doing the best we can, which is better than a conventional clothing company. And we still have really far to go and we're working hard to get there. So yeah. Sorry, I was interrupting because you were telling the story of moving from writing the handbooks to creating Lift Economy and the Force for Good Fund, and then the Next Economy MBA program, and then most recently your Next Economy MBA text.
Yes. And so with the Next Economy MBA and the Force for Good Fund, it was sort of, the Force for Good Fund was specifically looking at how, speaking with social impact entrepreneurs, women and folks of color, like one of the most challenging things is raising capital, and especially non-extractive capital, which is basically like, you don't have to give up your whole company and all the equity in it to raise money. And so what we did in 2016, 2017, the fund is almost wrapped up now, has created a fund to invest $1 million in 13 women and person of color owned businesses. And there's actually, I worked with Jessica Thomas and Liz, if they're on here. We actually did a North Carolina, I think Ford Foundation funded a study. So maybe, I don't know if Jessica or Liz, you can even throw that in the chat or send it out, but there's a study on the Force for Good Fund and its impacts. And the Next Economy MBA was our idea of what does it look like to create an economy that works for the benefit of all life? And it sort of got at the incrementalism, of social impact, which it's like, we know that, there's certain things we have to do, and we want to, for example, we can't tell companies to all become like worker-owned cooperatives or, donate all of their land to local indigenous groups. So it's like, how do we involve some of these conversations in some of the business? How do we involve some of these ideas in what would be a traditional like MBA program, but really like elevate some of them? So things like the gift economy, like what is the problem with debt, and like why are we how does debt focus on, or how does debt create a gigantic challenge, and how is money created, and like why is that a problem? How do we look at things like what is it, like teal organizations, and this concept of organizations without a boss. Like what does it look like for that? So it's sort of taking some of the things we were talking about in the MBA world, and really looking at how do we actually expand some of those conversations into what would be considered more like next economy or radical things. And so we have a 9-month MBA course that we're on cohort 11. Another cohort is starting in the spring, and we've had about 500 people go through that cohort. And so if folks are interested, I could share the link, but it's really looked at creating an economy that works for all life.
We would love for you to share the link, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. The last question I was going to ask, and then open it up for Q&A from the audience that I see are coming in the Q&A, which is great, is what are you working on now? So what's on the horizon for you and Lift Economy, in addition to the next cohort of the Next Economy MBA? Do you it sounds like you do have plans to write a new edition of the B Corp handbook in latter 2025 or 2026 when the new standards are released. What else are you engaging in and excited about?
Yeah, I think in terms of like personal and professional, I tend to blend heavily. So one of the things, this is super random to share with you all, but if anyone knows internal family systems therapy, that's super interesting, because it's all about how do we show up in the world, but understanding the different parts of ourselves and how they show up. So, for example, as business leaders, we might feel like there's a part of us that feels like we need to make as much money as possible. And there's another part of us that feels like that's probably not the best idea for the planet. And sometimes those parts fight inside of ourselves. And so on the personal level, I've been really interested in how do I identify those parts of myself and how they show up in my professional life. So internal family systems, there's a book called No Bad Parts by Dick Schwartz. So check that out. The other thing I would say is, yeah, I think what's next for us in terms of the B Corp world is really looking at the new standards coming out and how that's going to affect companies. Some of you may have been privy to some of the, there's been some controversy in the B Corp community about like which companies are getting certified and should they be certified, and like how are the standards being applied. And I think the new standards are a way to sort of reset some of those conversations and really look at, making sure all companies who are B Corps really have at least the same 10 things, like paying a fair wage, measuring carbon emissions, having a JEDI strategy, addressing purpose and stakeholder governance. And so I think it's actually going to be a gigantic shift. It's probably the biggest shift the B Corp community has ever had. Coming in the next 12 to 18 months. So I think for me and some of my team and the companies we're engaging with, they're sort of like, how do we start planning ahead for all these changes? A lot of companies are not actually measuring their carbon emissions, but as part of the new standards, you're going to have to measure your GHG emissions. And so a lot of companies if you're running B impact teams, you might start thinking about, reviewing the documents that B Lab has put out over the past 6 to 12 months and then we'll put out again in January of, what is upcoming and what are the expectations of companies, because it's going to be a big shift from, in the same vein, but a big shift because they'll be required for every company. And so as you're planning your B impact teams and that work, it's like, how are you setting your students up for success by making them aware of, hey, you should probably, when you're talking to companies, we know they're going to be one of the things is going to be carbon emissions and having a diversity and inclusion strategy and having climate action strategy. and measuring worker engagement. So those are some focus areas that you can start with prepping your students for as they're moving forward into 2025, when those standards become the law of the land. Oh, I think you're muted, Kristen.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, definitely a lot to think about, a lot to incorporate in our teaching and our lives. There are a number of questions in the Q&A, and so I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and she is going to moderate some of the questions in the Q&A.
Awesome. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A so that I can read them. So the first question is, could you comment on whether your handbook has a similar approach to impact to the approach seen in Ronald Cohen's book?
Wow, Sir Ronald Cohen. I actually haven't read his book, so I don't actually know, but I know who he is. So I wish I could answer that one. Unfortunately, I can't. No
worries. Another question that we have is, with the large growth in first-time certified companies, do you anticipate creating a handbook or section of the next handbook more about recertification and broader strategies to sustain/push for improvement?
That's a great question. I will admit, yeah, the first two editions were heavily new certification focused. And I do think with the community growing so much, now there's more of a need for what are we doing on recertification. And, I did hear Kristen say, I think it was you, Kristen, about an opportunity for the impact teams can be on the recertification of companies, because sometimes it's the initial certification, the company doesn't know what's going on, they're like relying on the students, and the students might feel a little bit out of the water. But on recertification, it can be like everyone knows what's happening, but it's some of the like nuts and bolts of like, hey, we got to do this, we want to do this. And so I do think both recertification is a very interesting target for the impact teams, but also yes to it's a long way of saying yes, I do think that the new edition should have more resources and support, whether it's from me and maybe a B Lab as well.
Great. And then we have another question. I think you touched on this a little bit, but what do you think is the role of academics in the movement? Actually, a two-part question. What do you think is the biggest challenge and or threat to the movement right now?
Wow. So I guess maybe I'll answer the first, or actually the threat one, because that's definitely a big one. So biggest threat for the movement, I think there's a couple threats. One is just, there's tension in the community that's always been there, and honestly is one of the reasons B Lab created the standards originally, which is who should be in the community and who shouldn't. So there's a lot of people who feel like we're doing the work, we've had these social impact things for 50 years, and now like this company is in, and why is this company in? And then there's companies who are like, we need that big company in because it helps us gain credibility and scale the movement. And so there's I think the threat is just what happens with the new standards, and like which companies are in and out based on that. But it's a threat that's always been there. And my friend Andy Fife, who's no longer at B Lab, but has been there for many, many years, has said over the years that B Lab is called a lab because they don't know all the answers. They're experimenting and trying things to see what works. So even if there's some rough early days of like the rollout of the standards, I'm confident that the lab component of B Lab will figure it out and sort of help. It's part of a process of continual improvement, similar to as we as companies want to be. It's not just you get certified once and you're a good company forever. You have to recertify every 3 years. And so similar to with the standards rollout for B Lab, version 1 of the new standards, there might be like some confusion, but then I'm confident that they'll work it out. So I think that's one threat, is just the whole component of like, is this company in or should this company not be in? Another threat is just, I think the sort of breadth of the movement and like what is relevant, what messaging and what language and what values are relevant to different communities around the world is a tough thing to manage. So, in the US, it might be like, as with B Lab US and Canada's theory of change around like climate justice, racial justice, and stakeholder governance, those 3 things resonate with folks in the US, but maybe in other places they don't resonate as much. And so I think that the way that the movement is growing is both good for gaining credibility, but it's a threat of like, how do you match the values of hundreds of different companies and hundreds of different countries around the world and regions.
I think we're out of time for questions. Thank you so much for being here, Ryan. That was great. I'll pass it back to Kristen.
Yeah, so thank you, Rachel, for asking our audience questions. Especially, I want to give a shout out to Maria. She was a founding B Academics board member for that last question. So we are needing to move on to our next agenda item. But Ryan, I just wanted to ask one last question, which is, how can folks find, follow, and get involved with your work at Lift Economy? And as we're transitioning to the next item on the agenda, maybe you could put that in chat for us. And again, we're so grateful for your sharing your precious time, energy, and attention with us today.
Thank you.